Today's episode of Better Bad Ideas, we're sitting down with Marianne Williamson. The two of us really get into the weeds. She was a candidate in 2020 for the President of the United States and also a candidate in 2024. We covered everything that's going on in D.C. We covered prior to the election, we covered during the election, and we covered what's going on right now. We had a spirited dialogue and debate. Let's get into it. I'm Sean O'Brien, General President of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters.
Put your helmets on, buckle your chin straps. It's a full contact sport.
We're going to find out who has a better bad idea. So I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule. I've got to say this. I met you probably December of 2023.
Yeah.
Where we did a roundtable of all presidential candidates. Who is Marianne Williamson?
Who is Marianne Williamson? Well, it's interesting because...
By the way, I was fascinated by you.
Thank you. Well, I very much enjoyed that endorsement meeting we had this last cycle. I enjoyed it very much. Very much. Who I am is not a big deal. I'm just a person. I've been a writer for many years. I've had a career over 40 years. And... because of my work, I've worked very up close and personal with people whose lives were in trouble. And that's really what made me feel qualified, as it were, to take on a political role at a time which is so different than the society of the past and the politics of the past. Usually when we think of political issues, we think very much in terms of symptom. And we have very little conversation about the deeper malaise that causes a society to go in a wrong-minded direction.
So where did you grow up?
Houston, Texas. And my father, you'll like this, my father in 1937 was a labor organizer for what was then the CIO Ford Motor Plant.
Oh, wow.
My brother also worked with Cesar Chavez down in South Texas. So I was raised to believe that being a scab is the worst thing you could be. If you cross a picket line, don't bother to come home. That's the world I grew up in.
So your dad eventually became an immigration attorney.
Lawyer, yes.
Okay, so you grew up pretty much upper class, upper middle class?
We would call it upper middle class at that point.
So your dad was an organizer. And when's the first time you heard the word scab?
Oh, at the dinner table. No, I was brought up with that conversation. And I was brought up with stories of Francis Perkins, FDR.
Sure.
This was in my blood. And also, I'm old enough to have been front row, as many of us are, to what happened, for instance, during the Reagan era. I tell a story, I think, in one of my books. I'm not sure. I was driving at, I think I was coming into somewhere at LAX, I think. And I had a friend in the car, and I saw a picket line. Pilots, I'm not sure. And I said,
well, if it was during the Reagan era, it was probably the air traffic controllers.
Right, air traffic controllers, I bet that was. And I said, we can't go, we can't do it. There's a picket line. And my friend said, oh, no, it's okay. You just go all the way down to the end, and then you can go around. And I stared at her.
So I would assume her dinner table dialogue wasn't the same as yours.
No, I think it's more interesting than that, because I said, I thought you were a Democrat. And she said, oh, I am. So there's something scarier than what you just said. It's a cluelessness that set in among so many people. And I think that when you go back the last few decades and recognize some of the things that happened, you can trace where did all this complacency come from? Where did all this farming out your best thinking to somebody else come from?
A sense of entitlement.
A sense of entitlement, a sense that it will never get to me. It might, this or that might be problematic for other people, but the problems would never get around to me or to my workplace. And I think that we're living in a period now of panic, grief. I mean, we're in the middle of it now.
Yeah, it's definitely very difficult times. But, growing up, I read you were influenced by a teacher, not influenced by a teacher, but you came home from school one day and you talked about the Vietnam War and how your teacher was pro-Vietnam. And your dad planned a trip to take you to Vietnam.
Yeah, it was
so most people, if they talk about an experience, something in your neighborhood, your mother or father will just grab you by the hand and walk you down to where the problem exists, and then you deal with it.
Well,
So
that's what he did.
Yeah, but you didn't literally walk down the street. And this is in the 60s or 50s?
Well, this would have been in the 60s, and I was in the 7th grade, and it was a social studies class, and our teacher began explaining to us about what was called the domino theory, right? Which is, of course, we have to fight in Vietnam. If we don't, all of Southeast Asia will fall. And so I went home that night, and I started explaining this to my parents. I'm explaining this to them.
So when you're explaining them, are you speaking from your position, or are you adopting the position that you learned in school?
I'm in the 7th grade, and I learned it in school, and the teacher told us.
So you thought
like it was fact, yes.
So you thought it was factual.
So I'm watching my mother, and I was like, oh, this isn't going to play well. I could see that on her face, but I didn't understand why. And I see my father's face growing pale, and I didn't know why. And then he stands up, and he slaps the table. He says, sweetheart, get the visas. We're going to Vietnam. And then I remember him saying, the military-industrial complex is not going to eat my children's brain.
So you have this dialogue back and forth about Vietnam, what you learned that day in school. How far after that discussion did you end up in Vietnam?
Oh, like as soon as I'm sure we were out of school. I mean, that was the part my mother played, you know?
Too bad the teacher wasn't like pro Disney World, right, back then.
Well,
and then your dad might have been able just to take it right to Disney World, right?
Well, you know, it's interesting because I think about that now. And even though I believe that teacher, given the politics of my family, and I think pretty much given the politics of the world now,
Sure.
looking at back at the Vietnam War, had it wrong. At least in those days, we could discuss political things in school. I was in public school in Houston, Texas. I'm very nervous now about the strictures being put, particularly now, the strictures being put on educators, what they can and cannot discuss.
And then there's a flip side to that, and I'm sure we'll get into it, but there's a flip side where, you know, educators, especially in college a few years back, were being kind of trying to be influential. Instead of teaching and allowing people to formulate their own opinions, they were accused of, you know, teaching a narrative based upon what their personal beliefs are.
Well, that's what she was doing. People do it on the left, people do it on the right.
Sure.
But having the conversation is important. You don't limit conversation. That's not the answer.
Well, that's, I think, too, that's a great point about limiting conversations because, you talk about mainstream media now, right? And we're sitting here doing a podcast and we're having a pretty frank, open discussion that's not scripted. And I think most people would agree that over the last several years that mainstream media has tried to control a narrative. If you do an interview with Fox, you do an interview with CNN, you do an interview with MSNBC, that's going to be a narrative that's going to be in a controlled environment that is going to have specific questions, and it's going to be very short-lived and one-sided. Now, thankfully, and I think you make a great point, that we should be able to have open dialogue and discussion, regardless of whether we're on the left or on the right or in the middle of the left or the right.
So much of what's happening today that's problematical has to do with the ethical breakdown, not only on the part of individuals in our society, but of our economy. So once the news, legacy news, mainstream news, became so profit-driven, then, as you said, somebody walks into the interview and they've got their story and they're sticking to it no matter what you say. And they will make you look however they want to make you look, or they will do whatever to undermine your message. So you're right. Independent media, long form podcasts and so forth is giving us much more of a chance to have the real conversations that are really, you know, I believe in what President Eisenhower said, the American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative. Mm-hmm. And I think at this point, my experience is that it has less to do with whether it's Fox or CNN or MSNBC, and it has more to do with the individual journalists and whether they're fair, whether they are ethical, because I've seen ethics and lack of ethics in all three.
But ethics are one thing.
Journalistic ethics.
Journalistic ethics are one thing, and you can be the most ethical person. It all comes down to who you're working for and what that person,
Well, that's my point.
What that corporation or that news media is looking to achieve. And if they're looking to achieve ratings, I don't think there's a concern on quality and credible journalism.
Well, that was my point. It's become a profit-driven business rather than journalistic ethics being the bottom line. Having said that, however, I have had Fox people, on Fox, on Rupert Murdoch's channel, give me a fair shot at an interview in ways that I did not receive on MSNBC, even though MSNBC politically is far more aligned with my own politics, but they were also aligned with a DNC version of events in which no one but Joe Biden should be listened to.
Yeah, well, that's a great point, because I've experienced the same. I've done a lot of media as a result of my day job, being the general president of the Teamsters Union, and we negotiated the largest collective bargaining agreement, United Parcel Service, $30 billion deal, richest deal in history. And I would go on to, the friendly media that we're accustomed to, that we've identified with in the past, the MSNBCs or the CNN, mostly a lot of the pushback or the narrative that I didn't agree with was driven by interviews like CNN, right? And I've gotten some good interviews with some people on CNN. MSNBC has been great, but I had a great experience with Fox.
Yeah.
People that I normally wouldn't talk to or wouldn't normally talk to me, talking to us about issues, talking to us about workers and members, talking to us about the economy, right? And so I got a fair shake there as well. So it's funny when you go to a lot of these, and I've got a great team. When you go to a lot of these interviews, you try and prep as much as you can, but sometimes you just can't control, and you don't know. You think you're going into a friendly environment, and then next thing you know, you've got 8 or 10 minutes of getting pushed and prodded, and everything you say is being kind of pushed back on and just challenging you the whole time, which I don't think is the right way to do it. To your point, let's have a conversation. We may agree to disagree, but let's have that conversation like adults, where the people that are watching it, and there's a certain demographic that watches those networks, right? And you get into podcasting, you get into all this social media now, you have a whole different demographic of 17 to 35, 36-year-olds that are not watching the CNNs of the world, that are not watching the Foxes or the MSNBC. So I think, our point to all this is, I think there's an ability out there to have venues or platforms that are going to allow for what I think you and I both want to achieve, which is, getting facts out there, having opinions matter, maybe disagreeing on situations, but not being a one-sided conversation.
Well, I think two things. I think, first of all, the point for people such as yourself, from myself, and for many of us, is that our truth should remain the same regardless who's talking to us. And that we do become better, having had the experiences that we've both had, of knowing, no, this is my story. And the fact that you're trying to manipulate this or not manipulate this, when we are at our best, what you're trying to do is secondary to what we are there to get across.
I don't think there's a lot of people that can try and manipulate your story or narrative.
Oh, like you, sir, I've been out there for a while. And I've taken some really hard knocks and learned the hard way a lot of things.
But it makes you the person you are.
It does. Yes, correct. I think that there's this challenge that faces a lot of us these days, to have a tough skin and a soft heart at the same time.
So growing up, you're a very spiritual-minded person. I think you have done a lot of life's work trying to spiritually enlighten people, motivate people, and help people. When did you realize your spirituality, and what impact has that had on your life?
I grew up in a conservative Jewish home. Conservative, in terms of the Jewish religion, doesn't have to do with your politics. It has to do with, there's Reformed, conservative, and Orthodox. So conservative is sort of in the middle. Mm-hmm. I had Orthodox grandfather, but my parents were not. But it was there was just no question but that God is. There's no question but that God's watching. There's no question but that you need to be a good person. You know, and it was just sort of in the air, as it were. And then when I was in college, I studied comparative religion and philosophy, and was really fascinated, whether it was Eastern or religion, whether it was the I Ching or Heidegger. It was all fascinating to me, the higher mind. And, you know, I grew up at a time when I was in college, you read Ram Dass and Alan Watts in the morning, and you went to an Vietnam anti-war protest in the afternoon. At that time, let's say in the 70s, the countercultural revolution at that time wasn't divided into lanes. It was everything in the 60s and 70s. Everything was changing. It was politics, it was spirituality, it was sex, it was music. It was just, and nobody was told to stay in your lane. Nobody was told to only be involved in one subject, which has made us a society of specialists. But sometimes it's the generalist who has a greater vision of what's happening here. What's happening with labor is connected to what's happening with a lot of other things, for instance. And it's not just a lot of economic things. So I grew up thinking that spiritual meaning in life applied not only to your personal life, but also to a nation. You know, it's interesting because in the Jewish religion and the Muslim religion, very different than the Christian religion. In Christianity, one's relationship with God is very personal. But among Muslims and Jews, the theology is connected to the relationship to the people. That the nation is to be a certain way. The people are to be a certain way. And I think that explains a lot about how Muslims are. For instance, if there's after 9/11, there was a lot of conversation, why aren't the quote unquote good Muslims speaking up? Well, I understand as a Jew, you will say things to other Jews, or a Muslim will say things to other Muslims that you don't want to say publicly because you don't want to increase anti-Muslim feelings or
you're going to bring further scrutiny onto your religion.
So I was just tikkun olam as a Jewish to repair the world. So my sense of political responsibility and one's moral and spiritual responsibility to God were never divided for me.
So when you were in college, did you know what you wanted to do in a professional career?
No, very much not, because my mother would say, and my parents were very upset, well, why don't you get a PhD in comparative religion and you could be, a professor? No. Why don't you go to rabbinical school? No. And then none of those things felt right for me. And then I started reading the set of books called A Course in Miracles, which is not a religion. It's based on universal spiritual themes, and it's about the psychology of releasing fear, becoming more loving, forgiveness, etc.
And I read in your biography that book had a tremendous influence on your life.
So I started talking about it. And I started talking about it at this place called the Philosophical Research Society. In the meantime, I was a temporary secretary. It never occurred to me that I would make a living doing this because this niche didn't even exist. Well, then the AIDS crisis came along. And so
what year are we in?
I was in LA.
No, but what year was it around?
This was in I moved to LA and started
85?
giving lectures, in 83. And then AIDS starts being like, what's happening mid-80s? And then full blown. And I was in LA.
So you go to LA and you're preaching this book. Right?
Yeah, well, I don't know, preaching, but speaking about it.
Speaking about it. And I read somewhere that you didn't deny anybody. You actually held it in your apartment at first.
Oh, absolutely. On the Philosophical Research Society, at one point there was a suggested donation
$7.
of the regular lectures of $3 and the $5 and $7. And of course, all the AIDS work the money was never touched.
So I got to tell you a funny story. I was brought up Catholic.
Yes.
And my mother made her sacraments in this church called St. Francis of Assisi. It's in Charlestown, Mass. And when I became president of the Teamsters, we had Father Mahoney, who was a great guy. He passed away probably 2 years ago, 93, 94 years old. So we talk about, supporting the Catholic Church and everything. So I would go in there for Mass with my mother every so often. And I'm the president of Teamsters Local 25, which is a big deal in Charlestown, Mass, in the city of Boston. And he was the chaplain to the fire department of the fire union. So I would go in, he would spot my mother and I, and this is probably 7 or 8 years ago, my mother and I walking into church, and he would include me in his lecture or somewhere in the Mass. He would include me, and he'd always say, "We've got one of the greatest labor leaders." So I knew at that point in time during the collection, I'm throwing $100 bill in there.
That's right. You better believe it.
So then my mother throws a 50. So then we know there's a second collection coming. So one of these times we're walking out, my mother's like, "You're not coming to church with me anymore. It just cost me $100.
It's gonna cost you too much money."
But no, it's just funny. It's a funny story.
I have a story to tell you about that that's very similar. Not very similar, but I think you'll appreciate this. My father was brought up in poverty. He was born in Hamtramck, Michigan, and then brought up in Rock Island, Illinois. My father, by the way, when he was a little boy, his father took him to hear Eugene V. Debs, and his father worked on the Rock Island Railroad. So my father, very poor, and I don't know what the story was, but St. Anselm's College gave my father a scholarship.
That's in New Hampshire, I believe, right?
Is it in New Hampshire? Yeah.
New Hampshire or Maine? Yeah. St. Anselm's?
Well, I get confused because then what was in Iowa? There's an Iowa. I'm not sure, but my father used to always say, the Catholics gave this poor Jewish boy an education. It's one of the many things that I wish now that my father's gone, I'd asked him more about, but he always said, the Catholics gave this poor Jewish boy an education. And any time we passed a Catholic church, my father would go in and leave $100 in the collection box.
So I think the moral to the story was my mother didn't want me going to
No,
church
she didn't want it. It was too expensive for you.
Because it was
No,
costing
I hear that.
It was costing some money. But that church, my mother basically grew up in the housing project in Boston.
Yeah.
And my mother, she had 3 younger brothers and, broken home back then, which was unheard of.
It's a very big deal, yeah.
In the late 40s, early 50s. And she would go to the Catholic Church, to St. Francis, Globe Santa, to make sure that her younger brothers had Christmas presents and everything else. So, the having a belief in a higher power and having faith in a religion, whatever religion that may be, I think it's extremely important, but I think it's kind of it's more rare than it was prevalent when we grew up.
Well, my own path over the last 40 years and longer professionally assures me that many people in the United States today, although they reject a lot of the dogma and doctrine of certain organized religious institutions, didn't mean to throw away the baby with the bathwater. And that's why there's a lot of interest in spirituality, non-denominational spirituality. And also, actually, there is a renewal within all the organized religious institutions as well right now. So I think that people all across the political spectrum and all across the religious spectrums now realize that the amoral.
So you read this book, you move to California, you start advocating, or you start enlightening people on what the book means to you, what it's all about, and then you become.
Well, and then I'm working a lot with AIDS patients because gay men in LA really gave me my career. They at that time, organized religious institutions, once AIDS exploded the way it did, organized religious institutions were eerily quiet for far too long.
I think some of them shunned.
Absolutely. Had to work through their own homophobic issues, etc. And Western medicine certainly was trying. It was like with COVID. It wasn't like they weren't trying, but were completely overwhelmed. So at that time, this then young woman.
And that was a pandemic, right?
Pardon?
You
absolutely.
would consider that a pandemic.
Oh, absolutely. So this then young woman, early 30s, talking about a God who loves you no matter what, and that in the presence of love, miracles happen. And then what happened was I suggested I write a book based on these lectures I was giving. And then, what was at that time, lightning strikes, Oprah Winfrey read my book. And then that changed everything.
Well,
and then
I read somewhere that you were like the spiritual advisor to Oprah
Well,
Winfrey?
I think that's Oprah has read many people's books, and
She bought 1,000 of your books, though.
She bought 1,000. She said it was the best book she'd read at the time. She was wonderful to me, but I have never said that I was her spiritual advisor, and I think it's really harmed my relationship with her, in a sense that I might have tried to exploit my relationship with her by saying that. I have never said that.
So that's something that other people, that's a narrative other people put in you, and she believes that you're...
Oh, I don't know what I can't say, but I know that I would never have in any way tried to exploit my relationship with her, and I'm extremely grateful to her. But she reads many people's books, including many people's spiritual books, and so I would never say, oh, I'm a spiritual advisor to...
I mean, she is hurting for cash.
Pardon?
She is hurting for cash, right?
Yeah, no, she's not. I don't think she's hurting for cash. But I can tell you from my own experience, she has made so many people's careers. I think not only am I personally so grateful to her, I think, many younger people don't know what that was like. When Oprah Winfrey's show, among other things, you look back on it now, it was kind of like a town hall of human decency 5 days a week. The vast majority of her shows were about some way of being a better person and making the world a better place. I don't think that it's possible to overestimate the contribution that woman made to this society.
And in one of your quotes, you say the word decent. You believe everybody is decent, or everybody has the potential to be decent. What is your opinion of the world being decent?
I think that an unfettered capitalist system in which capitalism and the American economy and American political system has become so amoral. It has made corporate profits the bottom line. God should be the bottom line, or one's notion, please forgive me, because not everybody would see it as God. Love should be the bottom line. Being good, as we understand it, should be a bottom line. Humanitarian issues should be a bottom line. And I believe, for instance, in many of the things that you deal with, some of the ways that workers will be exploited, for instance, in this society. One of the reasons, and labor is certainly one of the many reasons why I have the political passions that I have. It is indecent to treat people a certain way. It is indecent to have CEOs making millions and millions and millions and stock options and everything else we know about while somebody's working a hard day's labor and
someone's working 2 jobs.
Absolutely, and can't make it. Absolutely, it's indecent. You have even Adam Smith, who was the main architect of free market capitalism, said it cannot exist outside an ethical context. So when you say to someone like myself, whose primary concern is what is good, you stay over there. That has nothing to do with politics. It has nothing to do with what's going on in the society. Really? Because what we're dealing with right now, and I think that we are in a very, very dangerous moment, has everything to do with the fact that we were willing to go along with a system so unabashedly amoral, in which corporate profits meant more than anything else.
Well, I think there was a point in time where people just took the path of least resistance because they didn't really think they could effectuate change. And I think we have an ability now. And look, you've led the way your entire life on, spreading the word on what decency is, what having morals is all about. But it wasn't always that way. You didn't live this life where, you just woke up and everything was great and rosy. You had some struggles of your own.
Oh, I'm a human being, of course. And when in my 20s, I was a sex, drugs, and rock and roll generation.
Yeah,
so
I love one of your quotes.
I lived the life of my generation.
I think one of your quotes was, I was distracted by bad boys and good dope.
Well, so was everybody else at that time. Nothing unique. Very garden variety.
And you actually lived, one of the quotes also said that you lived a nomadic life for a while. I believe that was in New Mexico, correct?
Yeah.
So what was that like? I mean, that was before you that was right after you dropped out of college, went to New Mexico for a little while. We're kind of going backwards a little bit here. But where I'm going with this is, you suffered some mental health issues.
Well,
or you had maybe really a bad breakup or two.
Yeah, I
think we've all been there.
Well, but you touched something that I feel very strongly about. The 20s are hard. Mm-hmm. They're not a mental illness. And I think some really bad things are happening among young people today who are being told they have a mental issue when really, no, it was your first heartbreak.
Well, I have a
and life is
24-year-old.
hard, and the economy is messed up.
I have a 24-year-old and a 24-year-old and a 21-year-old.
It will not, and they're going through how hard it is to be in their 20s today. And they're going through the fact that the economy is not as easy as it was when I was that age.
Well, my youngest, his economy is going great because of me.
Yeah, well.
I'm his ATM machine. He has no idea about the economy.
Lucky guy.
Nor does he care.
That's pretty funny, actually. But you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And too many of these people in their 20s are being made to believe that they have a mental health issue. And I think that's very, very dangerous. Or somebody being told you have an anxiety disorder. The society is an anxiety disorder for many of the reasons that you work on daily. Too many people are stressed. When you have, I don't need to tell you the statistics, when you have a $50 trillion transfer of wealth on the bottom 90% to the top over the last 50 years, when you have 3 people owning more wealth than the bottom 50%, when you have almost...
Were you listening to that hearing today?
Yeah,
You
but
just
I
stole,
knew it anyway.
You just stole that. You stole that from Bernie Sanders.
I did steal it from
kidding.
Bernie Sanders. And listen, I was a Bernie, I don't think I stole it from Bernie Sanders, but absolutely he's been a role model to me, as he's been to so many others. You can't have too many people pointing out that almost half of American people live paycheck to paycheck.
No, you're right.
How can you, and as he was pointing out today, how can you not be stressed? And the fact that we're the only advanced democracy that does not have universal health care.
So getting back to the point you made about the 20-year-olds.
So once again, but I don't want to leave it at that. It's very important. That is not a mental illness that you find. That's not a mental health issue. That's an economic injustice issue. And more Americans need to realize this.
What role do you think COVID played? So having a 24-year-old and a 21-year-old, my 21-year-old was 17 or 16, going on 17. The world shuts down. Social interaction shuts down. Did that play a role in the assumption that COVID had an impact on the mental health of the 20, 21-year-olds?
Apparently, more and more studies are coming out that would indicate, yes, the lack of social involvement. An entire generation who are led to experience, not just believe, but experience, not just based on trend, but in a case like that, the schools, classrooms shutting down, based on their actual educational experience, that life is on the screen.
So what emotionally effect do you think that had on
terrible people? Some of the things that are going on in this society today, excuse me, those are human beings you're talking about.
So the 20-year-olds that we just talked about saying, hey, you know what? Maybe it's not a mental health issue. Maybe it's not an anxiety issue. But I think there's no denying the fact that going through COVID in the mid to late teens was pretty traumatic for a lot of these kids.
I think there are mental health issues. I'm not saying that mental health issues don't exist. I'm just saying mental health issues should not be used as an excuse by an unjust system to cover its tracks. Mm-hmm. But in terms of what you're pointing out there, and so many kids who in the years when learning how to interact socially is everything.
So I know in our world, we manage health and welfare funds as part of our job as labor leaders. And we have seen over the last 10 years, which can't violate any HIPAA laws, but we watch trends. We watch trends with participants and the dependents are usually the children. And we have noticed over the last 10 years that there is a spike in diagnosis of mental health issues through our health and welfare funds, meaning that, there's a lot of our members' children that are suffering from depression, suffering from bipolar disorder, suffering from issues.
If mommy and daddy, in the 1970s, the average American couple could afford a car, could afford a house, could afford a yearly vacation, and could afford, if they wanted, for one parent to stay home with the kids. A lot of these children you're talking about, mommy and daddy have to work.
It's an economic stress.
Not just that. Mommy and daddy are so exhausted when they come home. They don't have time and bandwidth and energy to be with the children, to read them books before they go to bed, they're not able to go see the kids' baseball game. They're not having what we used to see and think of as normal attachment, parental attachments with children, familial attachments. Now that should be our society's bottom line, the capacities of individuals and families to thrive, not corporate profits. Bottom line.
Right. But growing up, when I grew up and probably when you grew up, both of my parents worked. And my father worked 2 or 3 jobs. My mother worked. My mother was the nurturer of our family. She raised 3 boys, all close in age. But the one thing is that she was at work, but she also nurtured us.
So what time did she come home from work?
I don't know, 2:30, 3 o'clock. She was home when we got home.
Hello.
But it also wasn't all these distractions
Yes.
that people face today.
That also.
Social media, Facebook, all this stuff where people, even adults with children, when they can be spending time with their kids, and we're all guilty as charged, is buried in their phones.
But let's talk
doing
about what you
things.
can control and what you can't control.
Right.
So people are becoming more aware. We're all addicted to the tablet. Put it down. People are becoming more aware. Don't let your child have their phone or their tablet at dinner and so forth. But with the economic issues, sometimes it's not something people can control. The fact that your mother could be home by the time you got home from school is everything. They've done all kinds of studies. I remember when I was living in Detroit and I attended this conference, those are the hours that matter. Those are the hours that matter right after school. Most crime was being committed between 3 and 5 in the afternoon and so forth. You just can't leave economics out of it.
No, economics plays a big role in everything that goes on today in society. So let's fast forward. Did you ever dream you would seek a career in politics, going through your 20s, 30s, 40s?
I don't know if I think of a career in politics now, but this is what happened for me. As I said to you earlier, I worked with people in some of the most agonizing hours. The joke used to be, nobody calls Marianne because things are going well. I was the person that you called after the news came back and it's cancer. I was the person you called when the accountant said, bankruptcy is the only
So
option.
we're kind of like labor leaders the same
I
way.
bet, yeah. And what I began to expect, but when I was in my early 80s through most of the 90s, the people I would be with, somebody, a loved one had died or whatever, most of the people that I knew, the crisis was the exception. It wasn't the rule. What I started to experience, especially when I moved and I was the minister at a non-denominational church in Michigan, in Warren, Michigan, towards 1998, was I began to meet more people, first in Michigan and then all over this country, for whom the crisis was the rule and not the exception. The problem wasn't just that they were diagnosed with cancer. The problem was that they didn't have health care. The problem wasn't just that they couldn't find a job. They had to work 2 or 3.
And there weren't many jobs back then anyway.
Yes, and then what this does to the relationship with the husband or the wife or the children and the complete family breakdown. So I began to realize it, and I had been very involved with founding nonprofits and so forth, but I began to realize about that time, no amount of private charity can compensate for a basic lack of social justice. And so I didn't think a career in politics. I just looked around and I saw things that were not changing and that I didn't think were going to change, apparently. And speaking of mental health, I remember a U.S. Senator saying to me when I was in Michigan, and I was at a big church, she said, Miss Williamson, do you have any ideas what we should do about the mental health crisis? And I said to her, yeah, why don't you stop driving people crazy? Why don't you raise the minimum wage? Why don't you work on making life easier for people?
So a typical quote from someone from Boston that was posed that question,
Yeah.
say to my mother, who I love dearly.
Yeah.
If someone said that to her, she'd be like, "Why don't you just toughen up?" Right?
Well, I do think there's some of that in life that has its appropriate place. I do think that
Stop
we have an
driving people
entitled.
crazy.
Both are true. Both are true at the same time. Stop it with your entitlement. Stop it with your victimhood. Stop it with your weak underbelly. And the society should be more just. Those are not contradictory. They're both true.
So your first run at politics was 2014.
I ran for Congress
in California, right? 33rd
Yes,
district?
and coming from a good place, I'd been a Democrat all my life, and I thought, well, what we need
But you got some
is,
big endorsements too, though, right?
huh?
You got some big endorsements, some labor support.
I think so. But the problem I made, I don't even remember, but I think so, yes. I ran as an independent, and I learned through experience that there are forces in this country, both among Democrats and Republicans, who are very, very intentional that no one in the independent space is
It's hard to break.
going to
it's
have
hard
a good and fair
to,
shot. Yeah.
It's hard to crack into that sector if you're an independent. And isn't there a statistic that most independents vote Democratic anyways?
Well, not so much anymore. I mean, look at what's happening in this country. Now the biggest demographic is independent. And I think people, I don't think, Sean, given this moment we're living in, that anything that was is necessarily applicable to what is right now.
And I think that's part of the problem because, and I think we saw it during this last election cycle where the traditional thinking and the traditional allegiance Democrats had to working power seemed to have changed, and we witnessed a change. And then you had the Republicans saying now they wanted to be the working people's party. And, you look back 20, 30 years ago, you talk about that strike line you're driving by, right? Republican. But people don't realize that deregulation was championed by Democrats, Ted Kennedy, which for us, deregulation of the trucking industry in 1980, championed by Ted Kennedy. A senator named Joe Biden signed off on it, deregulating the trucking industry, amongst other industries, right? And that we lost 400,000 Teamster jobs as well. You talk about strain and economic hardship on a family where you were once a prosperous truck driver, knowing you're going to make 40 to 50,000 in the 80s, and because politics played such a role in profits, were taken into consideration more than someone making a modest living. People forget who actually championed deregulation.
Well, unfortunately, the failure of the Democratic Party over the last few decades to stay with its unabashed support and advocacy for the working people of the United States, that moral swerve, I believe, is what's helped get us here today. Nothing that you mentioned, though, can compare to our current president's firing Gwen Wilcox, making sure that the NLRB doesn't...
We'll get to that in a minute. I just want to go through a little bit of your aspirations after 2014.
Right.
Unsuccessful run at Congress. Then 2020, you throw your hat in the ring as a candidate for president, correct? Now, you ran against Joe Biden.
I did.
Okay.
In 24, you're talking about? Or 20?
Run in 20?
Well, 2020 because he was.
So, what made you want to run for president of the United States?
In 2020 or in 2024?
2020.
I just had this deep sense that I should. There was no way I was a major candidate. No way I thought I would be a major candidate. But I saw the dark clouds on the horizon. And I was right. I saw the dark clouds on the horizon.
And what are those dark clouds?
Pardon?
What are those dark clouds that you saw?
Fascism in America. We all need to just stop pussyfooting around it now. And I saw things that I felt, certainly Bernie was holding the space for talking about the economic issues alone, but I felt that there were larger issues involved that needed to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, Bernie was talking about what we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
The disparity in wages.
Absolutely.
The restoration of a strong middle class, putting workers before profits. That was his narrative, and it rings true today.
Absolutely.
I think, Bernie is a good friend. He's a great ally, and he's done some great work on behalf of working people. So he had that kind of niche covered in the campaign. What were you focused on?
Well, I was certainly focused on that, but I also thought that there was a larger conversation that needed to be had about where these things came from. I was talking, for instance, about food. I was talking about our sickness care. You know, Bernie was talking about Medicare for all, which I certainly agreed with. But one of the points that I was making, which unfortunately that whole gang has been now lured over into another camp now, but I was talking about...
When you say that gang, who are you referring to?
Well, what I mean is that well, let me first say what I said.
Sure.
On the debate stage in 2020, I said, we don't have a healthcare system. We have a sickness care system. And so Bernie was talking about Medicare for all. I wanted to talk about how bad chronic disease was in the United States. I wanted to talk about the fact that we had a higher rate of chronic disease than in any other advanced nation. I wanted to talk about our food supply. I wanted to talk about big agricultural companies. I wanted to talk about chemical companies. I wanted to talk about what Big Pharma was doing. I wanted to talk about some of the things that Bernie was not taking on, such as the environmental issues that I wanted to talk about in a bigger way, military-industrial complex, et cetera. I never saw myself in that sense as competing against Bernie Sanders. But I felt that I was bringing things into the conversation that were important. In 2024, I thought if I didn't, then nobody was going to be talking about those things. Mm-hmm. And I knew that Joe Biden, regardless of the good things he was doing, there were some other things that were not being addressed, and I knew that it wouldn't end well.
Yeah, so you know, the Joe Biden, and I took a lot of criticism from going to speak at the RNC, but prior to that, you know, we had that roundtable that you participated in. We had every single candidate for the first time come to our building and actually talk to, not union officials, talk to rank and file members and answer questions. And Joe Biden did do some good things for labor, and you know, passing the one of the omnibus bills that fixed pensions nationwide. And like we talked about earlier, that was a great deal for working people whose pensions were in critical and declining status, multi-employer plans. But what they failed to tell you is that the reason why a lot of these pension plans were in the position they were is because of legislation in the 80s, like deregulation, where 400,000 Teamster jobs were lost, companies were forced into bankruptcy. And I always use this analogy, and it sounds like a broken record, but it's easy to understand. In my neighborhood, we used to play a lot of street hockey. So in 1980, if I broke my mother's window shooting a street hockey puck, and then 40 years later, I decide to fix it, should I look for accolades from my mother from a problem that I created, right? So, you know, although they did fix them, but again, you look back in history, what caused some of these problems? And I think that's where the criticism comes from when we didn't make an endorsement. And the Democrat far left started attacking us, saying, we fixed your pensions. You did, and we appreciate it, but you caused the problems that broke them. And I think that's part of what you're talking about here.
Well, yes. Also, I mean, I heard your Joe Rogan interview and that she only answered 3 questions.
I've never been on Joe Rogan. I was on Tucker Carlson.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. But is it Tucker Carlson where you said that she had only answered 3 questions?
Yeah, and you know, in that script that you had, I think there was 16. Mm-hmm. I think you answered all 16 questions.
Wait, that was that was this last time.
There was this last time, yes.
So let me ask you, if I may, because I don't think this is your show. She answered 3 questions. And if I remember, is that what you said?
She answered, I'll tell you, I think she answered, she was on the verge of answering the 4th question.
And her staff said no more.
Her staff, and just so you know, so we invite you to come speak to us like we did every other candidate. Mm-hmm. And this is great. I'm glad you brought this up. We give the same questions to you that we give to everybody.
Right.
You did not call my staff or our staff and try and negotiate those questions down on what you wanted to answer.
Never occurred to me I could, sir.
You answered all of them. Okay. Every single candidate, with the exception of every candidate answered those questions, with the exception of Biden and Harris.
Okay.
They negotiated down what they were gonna answer. So it was difficult, to be honest with you, to say the least. And you know, President Trump came in, he answered all the questions, didn't give us the answers we wanted, just like a lot of the candidates.
I want to ask you a question, if I may. Did I answer them well?
You did answer them well. Yes.
And I answered all of them?
You did.
So of the Democratic candidates, and you're saying Trump answered them all, but not to your liking. So of the people that you interviewed, did I do the best?
I don't know if you did the best. It's hard to say because we had Cornel West.
Okay.
Entertaining. Oh my God, that was probably. I wish we could have actually made a podcast out of that. He answered all 16. I don't know what he was answering, but he answered 16 questions. But he was funny. Very, very smart man. RFK answered all 16 questions.
How did he do?
He did well, but you know what? It was the good thing about the whole process, and I'll get to your question, your answer to your question in a second. Everybody had a different perspective on the questions they were asked, if that makes sense. The answers we were looking for, I think we're so used to dealing with issues that are specific to us. We are looking for the black and white answer that may not be the right answer. So, I mean, I would say, you definitely performed better than Harris, better than Biden. I think RFK and you probably did the best.
So let me ask you a question. If RFK, although at that time, was RFK an independent? Probably by that time.
I believe he was an independent at the time.
So did you consider, given that Bobby Kennedy and I gave the best answers, did you consider endorsing either of us?
Well, I'll tell you what we did. The consideration was, because when we asked all the candidates to come, I think it was probably October, November of 23, and you responded immediately. President Trump responded immediately. Cornel West, I think Asa Hutchinson.
Yeah.
So all in a row, like we lined this thing up, and we didn't yet poll our members at all to see where they stood, because it wasn't our normal process. We normally, what we would do in the past and under a previous administration, and I was part of that administration as a regional vice president, we wouldn't poll our members, and we wouldn't make a decision to endorse till after both respective conventions. And that's historically how it's been done in the Teamsters world.
Oh, I see.
But the one thing that we did differently was bring candidates into our building to actually have them address the rank and file members, which was the first time process ever. After all the candidates came, we did some polling. We did a straw poll polling within the union halls. And then we did a polling with our magazine with a QR code that goes to 1.3 million members. And then we used the pollsters that Harris and Waltz, or Biden and Harris, were using as well to do a poll. We used the same exact polling. We got the same results for the magazine QR code. It was about 63 or 64% were for Republicans.
So
Trump.
That's interesting, actually.
Yes.
When we were in the room for the endorsement interview, I don't remember seeing a camera. Was there a way that your members actually got to see those endorsement interviews?
We did not televise. I think we respected people's opinions and narratives.
Yeah.
And we didn't record them or publicize them. We did publicize the performance
right
towards the end with the two remaining candidates.
So when you said you got about 63% of your voters went Republican in their endorsement, was that different than had been true for you in previous elections? That you had such high Republicans?
we never really polled our members extensively. Oh. They did some polling, but it was certain demographics, certain geographies. When we put a QR code on a magazine, that we send out a publication, it goes to 1.3 million active members.
So let me ask you, because you were talking before about how Teddy Kennedy and Biden began some of the deregulation, and you've been kind of hard on the Democrats. But listen, I ran against them, so I've been hard on the Democrats
but I'll tell you why I've been hard on the Democrats. I'm a lifelong Democrat.
Yeah,
always will be. What I didn't like and why I'm hard on them is because the Democratic Party that I was brought up with and that I knew and that I embraced and adored is not the same Democratic Party. But what I learned, and this is important because I think you need to know this, I am critical. I'm critical of anybody that's not doing the right thing. I don't care if you have a D, an R, and an I.
Sean, I You're talking to
Preaching to the choir.
You're preaching to the choir here, and the same has been true of me as well. Having said that, this is where we're all stuck. It's between what are you going to go with, the racket or the mafia? We've got two unsavory forces.
Right, but think about this. We should be in a position, when I say we, society, America, the American citizen, to take a position, regardless of whether you agree with it or I agree with it or not. Why I'm critical of the Democratic Party, and I'm going to hold the Republicans accountable for what they promised during the election. But when I spoke at the RNC, and I asked both the RNC and the DNC to speak at, I would have gave that same speech, and I think you've heard that speech.
That's fascinating that
right?
you asked them and they turned you down.
Well, no, they didn't turn me down. When they did turn me down ultimately, but the RNC responded right away. Would love to have you here. And I gave a speech that was about everything we talked about today: corporate greed, corporate elitist, what the working people need, what working men and women in this country are suffering from as a result of the corporate greed. And I highlighted everything. And it wasn't geared towards getting support from Republicans. It was just giving a message.
Right.
And 2 weeks prior to that, I met with Chuck Schumer, who we gave a check for $550,000 to a Senate majority PAC,
right.
one of those PACs. I can't remember what it was. And I said, look, Senator Schumer, I'm going to be speaking at the RNC. He's like, oh, that's good. You should do that, right? As soon as I did that, I was getting criticized and attacked from the far left Democratic Party, which I'm looking at it going, this is funny. This is making me laugh because, the attacks are very personal, and the attacks are not necessary because the speech I gave, if you took the time to listen, was geared towards the support and the responsibility of each and all parties when it comes to working people in America. So I am a little critical because I take a position, and my thing is this, and I'm working with both sides of the aisle right now. I have been for 3 years prior to all this election. And why are we doing that? Because you can't draw a line in the sand and think that there's actually change that's going to help workers, help Americans.
But then what happened with you, the idea of you speaking at the Democratic Convention?
Well, after I spoke at the RNC, it was well received by a lot of our members. It was well received by society. And I think, the Democrats just were truly offended that a labor organization that they thought was like 10th grade geometry, a given, that they were going to get us no matter what.
Right.
And how dare you go speak at a Republican National Convention after we've done this, this, and this.
Like they were doing you a favor to let you speak.
And our members, to your point, our members don't want to be told what to do. Listen, you had a rebellious 20s, right?
I had what?
You had a rebellious 20s. When you were 20 years old,
I have a rebellious 70s.
Right,
I'm a rebellious woman.
So listen, do you like when people tell you what to do?
No, and listen, the way I've been treated by the Democratic Party, and look at the way Bobby Kennedy was treated, and then how did that go? He took 1 million or so people over to Trump. Believe me, I understand, and I've been a big critic of the Democratic Party for the same reason that you have said. And when you said a few minutes ago, you're going to hold him accountable, he's already destroyed the NLRB.
Well,
I don't think he plans to put anyone else on there.
Here's what people don't understand, okay? We were very influential in getting Lori Chavez DeRemer
and you
nomination.
heard her today.
And we worked hard. I was there. And look, that whole thing is a whole, that process is crazy. I know what she's done. I know what she's capable of doing. And, I think she's going to be great if she's confirmed. And, when you're sitting there in your fates, laying in the hands of Republicans and Democrats, this choice should be a layup because her father's a retired Teamster getting a pension. She supported a PRO Act, right? She signed on to it. It was never voted on. But let me finish, right? And you don't know this because this is inside baseball. The PRO Act that was highlighted for the last year and a half was going to be used as a political pawn so that the Democrats could introduce it, so that the Republicans could say no, because there's certain provisions in there that the Republicans didn't like. And who was going to suffer as a result of that? That was going to be used to say, see, the Republicans don't want to work with you. And people forget, in 2008, 2009, when we had a Democratic House, Democratic Senate, and a Democratic president, what was our biggest issue, labor, back then?
PRO Act.
Was the Employee Free Choice Act, which is basically the version of PRO Act. And we couldn't get it passed then.
I couldn't agree with you more. The things that we could have done in the first 2 years of Obama. He had the House, the Senate, and this White House. I couldn't agree with you more. And I've spoken of these things. But let me ask you a question about today. Yes, she voted for the PRO Act in the past. Mm-hmm. She clearly squirmed out of that today in the hearing.
Well, I don't think she squirmed out of it. I think, and just so you know, we are working with both Republican and Democratic senators right now to create a version of the PRO Act by collaborating. And hopefully Senator Josh Hawley will introduce it, where it makes it easier to organize, where there is a mandate on when negotiations would start, and there is a mandate and an arbitration process to get to a collective bargaining agreement within a timely fashion. Now, NLRB, just so you know, our union organizes all the time. We've organized 75,000 members in the last 3 years, okay? The Democrats have been in power 16 out of the last 20 years. We have avoided the NLRB under almost every administration because it takes too much time, and it definitely needs a whole revamp. We need an NLRB. There is no question to that. And I know you started to say that, well, Trump fired, the Democratic appointee and everything else. That's all going to be worked out in either the courts or whatever the case may be. And I don't want to see anybody lose their job. I don't want to see...
It's not just about losing, it's about the quorum.
Right, the quorum, right? But think about it this way. An organization like the Teamsters Union, we're trying to organize Amazon, right? Amazon's our biggest threat. I'm fighting with United Airlines right now. I've been fighting with all these corporations under the Biden administration, under the NLRB, and we did get a favorable ruling under a joint employer, but there was no way around ruling in our favor with Amazon. But we've been fighting all these corporations, and you have people like Chuck Schumer, you have a lot of Democrat senators that wouldn't sign on or wouldn't even show up at our picket line when we struck Amazon nationwide.
It's disgraceful.
So we can say whatever we want about what's going on with the NLRB. There's one thing that we certainly may agree on. I think if you took the pulse of labor in general, we need an NLRB. People get fired. It's unfortunate when a new administration comes in, and there's going to be a remedy of some sort, whether it's favorable or not. But the one thing is that, and I said this the other day in a speech that I gave, we've struck 200 employers in 3 years, okay? Majority of that's for recognition because we don't want to put our members or potential members in harm's way through a antiquated process through the NLRB that may encourage retaliation and retribution for those people that are seeking to be unionized. So we do direct action, so to speak, which has been very effective. Now, everybody's, saying, well, the NLRB, it's not in existence right now. It's not. There's not a quorum, and you're 100% right. But that's when we should be taking advantage of it as labor and going after these employers, striking them for recognition, striking them for bad behavior. And that's where we should be, and that's where we're going to be as an organization. But as far as people getting fired and losing their job, look, the administration came in, and they didn't come in subtle. They did not come in subtle. And they laid off a bunch of people. And I think because they're unionized, they're going to have an ability to have their unions fight for their jobs to come back. But I always come back to my organization and who I represent. Did anybody know that 22,000 people at Yellow Freight lost their jobs a year and a half ago?
At where?
Yellow Freight.
No.
Right? They lost it because of mismanagement and an administration that wouldn't extend a loan that the federal government gave through Treasury in 2016 to this corporation. There wasn't a mass call to arms to defend those 22,000 people that are laid off. We deal with layoffs every single day in this organization. We deal with people losing their job, and we're out there fighting hard for them.
But wait a minute. You just asked me if I knew about Yellow Freight.
Yes.
I didn't.
Right.
I didn't know.
Well, it was publicized. We publicized it.
And I'm sorry I didn't know. But the 75,000 that we're talking about?
We organized.
No, I mean now at federal workers. This is more than just people losing their jobs.
Oh, I understand. Agree.
This is a purge.
And I said to you earlier, I don't agree with anybody losing their job. They shouldn't lose their job.
But this is more, I think all of us just as Americans have to deal with what this is. I am not as optimistic as you that the normal traditional remedies that are available will be available in this situation.
Well, that's a great point because, look, there's been a lot of rhetoric on the Democratic side and the Republican side and out of the administration, right? And what's the worst case scenario? No one lives up to the promises they made. 2028 is not that far away where, you know, people should actually be focused on what's in the best interest of the country. And I always tell people, we're going to look at the 101st day and see where we're at and make an assessment and make a decision on what direction we're going to go.
You and I have a different take on what's happening right now. And I hope you're right, and I hope I'm wrong. Because you are assuming that the next 4 years, like you said, 28 isn't that far away, 26 is soon. I have deep concerns.
Oh, absolutely. Listen, I have concerns too. And, you know, my assumptions, look, I don't look at this from any other perspective than, look, I have a job to do and I've got to protect American workers and I'm going to do that. And that's my job. And I want to hold people accountable. I want to hold these politicians accountable. I want to make certain that they understand who they represent, and they represent constituents that are my members.
Well, that's a big deal. So that's a question I have for you. I understand the things that the Democrats did not do for your members that you and I both agree as old-time Democrats should have been done. I don't disagree with you at all.
And I want to see a Democratic Party the way it used to be.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, and that's why I ran for president. I'm with you. However, what did they see in the Republicans, given the Republican track record? Because for me, another thing you and I have not talked about is the fact that we didn't have universal health care and so forth. What did they see? You know, before the election.
I think they saw abandonment. Now think about this.
I agree with you. So are you saying that it was the abandonment by the Democrats that mainly did that?
I think the Democrats, not all of them, majority of them, they fell in love with the billionaires in big tech.
I agree.
Silicon Valley.
Yeah. And then look how Silicon Valley's turned against them for that.
What's the biggest threat to my organization and my members?
I would think Silicon
Technology.
Valley. Yeah.
And AI. Now, if you look at, where is Kamala Harris from?
Well, she's from California, not Silicon Valley,
No, but
though,
where's
right?
she from?
California.
Who is her brother-in-law?
Head of him. He's like, isn't he a big guy with one of
Uber.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah, right.
So, you know, when I say a sense of abandonment, that crowd that I address at the RNC, they had billionaires. They had people that despised what I stand for, what we stand for, what working people are. If I gave that same speech at the DNC, if I was invited, and look, I do not, you know, this is nothing personal. I'm glad, you know, in a way I'm glad they didn't invite me to the DNC, but I would have gave that same speech at the DNC. There would have been different faces, but I bet you there would have been the same amount of billionaires in those boxes.
Right.
And those billionaires that the Democrats have embraced, and kind of it's like a Stockholm syndrome.
Yes.
They've fallen in love with their captors right now. Are the same people that are trying to destroy good American jobs. So I may not be, or I may seem to you to be optimistic about what's going on right now. I'm not. I'm a realist. I want to see results on behalf of American workers, but we've got to look at both sides of the equation.
Okay,
here.
so tell me if I'm right. This is how I've put it, because this seems to fit in with that.
I certainly don't want to tell you you're wrong, because I think there's going to be massive consequences.
I think there are consequences going on right now, including to workers. Hello, the federal workforce.
They are, absolutely.
And
but we've been going through those consequences for decades upon decades.
What now?
Unions have been fighting those consequences for decades.
But this to me, Shauna, is more than just people losing their jobs. See, to me, this is bigger than that. This is why they lost their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Why they lost their jobs. This wasn't to save money.
And look, I want to be clear.
This was to purge. This is much bigger than the normal
Listen,
mass
the facts
firing.
are all going to come out.
Pardon?
The facts always
The facts
come out.
are out. What does it matter? They don't care.
They're out. Well, the reality, and I'm not defending anybody, but there is an appetite in this country for accountability, right? And I don't know whether people are looking at this as, oh, great, we have an administration that's coming in, want to hold people accountable, or is this retaliation?
It's
right?
worse
There's a
than
fine
either
line.
one. It's worse than either one. This is what Stalin did. This is what Hitler did. You purge the whole civil service. They want to make business basically not work so that they can just sell off the pieces to the private sector.
So if you were president of the United States, let's say you won in 2024, would you come in and take a look at the size
Absolutely.
of government?
Yeah, look, that of itself is more than legitimate. If any president, Democrat or Republican, said the federal workforce is too big, it's kind of uncontrollable, it's unaccountable, we're going to come in here. And I would have said, good. And if that person had then said, as Trump said, we're going to have an advisory board. We're going to have people who are going to make recommendations. That's what we were told. We're going to have, whether it's Ramaswamy and Musk or Musk himself, whatever, they're going to make recommendations. And they are going to talk to the inspectors general. They're not going to come in and fire summarily the people who actually were doing oversight. And they are going to talk to the to the people who are heads of these agencies, find out what goes on there. They're going to report their findings to Congress. There will be a deliberative process. In other words, a democratic process. I would have been the first one to say, well, that sounds like a good idea. That's not what happened here. This was a dictatorial decree. It is dictatorial right now. The man himself has had billions of dollars of government contracts. There is no oversight of that. I don't know.
So you watched the hearing today, right?
Yes, I did.
Speak about the government contracts. And I don't know Elon Musk from a hole in the wall.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of allegations today were made about his issues at the NLRB's, issues at DOL, and the government contracts came up today.
Of course, and he and Bezos trying to make the NLRB saying it's unconstitutional.
Listen, Jeff Bezos, I think he's despicable. But there was a point brought up today that Musk got a lot of those contracts from the Biden administration. Is that true or not?
Oh, absolutely. I think even the $400 million in the armored Teslas supposedly he got. Listen, I don't think...
Right. And if there's a conflict, like in the real world, and, there's a lot of times we sit in situations as on boards, different boards, and if there's a conflict of interest, you recuse yourself. Now, there's been some media reports saying that was said, but it wasn't said strongly or directly.
It's the honor system. I think that actually Trump used the words, the honor system. The honor system. You're talking about billions of dollars. And then Trump says, well, he's not, he will recuse himself. Otherwise, I won't stand for it. But clearly, look, you can see who's in charge there. This is dictatorial decree going on here. Back to what you were talking about before about the abandonment. And I had said to you earlier that I'm interested in the psychological forces at play here, which obviously are huge. I remember there was a man named George Lakoff who used to talk about the fact that the Republican Party, he said, was like an abusive father. And he said was the critical father, and the Democratic Party was the nurturing mother. And I said, let's be real here, George. The critical father has become an abusive father. But the mother, the nurturing mother, stands outside the door while the kids are being whipped. She doesn't call the police. She says to the kids after they get their whipping, how about some milk and cookies? And then she actually sleeps with the abuser later that night. And I said, those kids will grow up in therapy and be angry at the mother before they'll be angry at the father because she let it happen. And so when you said that about abandonment, that rings true to me. The Democratic Party, in its current iteration, let this happen. over the last 10 years. And even if you look at what happened with Bernie, what happened with me, with Dean Phillips, to some extent with Bobby Kennedy, this idea that they knew better, and that because Trump represented such a threat to democracy, they were going to suppress democracy in their own house. And to me, all of that just paved the way for this to happen.
So what's in the future for you moving forward?
I don't know what's in the future for me. I've hopefully matured to the point where I realize that it's about the present, not the future. And that I do believe that two things. I believe the future, an abundant future, is born out of living as purposefully as you can in the present. I know that right now I'm talking to you, and that why should we assume that anything in the future is any more important than this conversation in the present? But also I think, and I know, I heard what you said. You're obviously not dumb. You're not seeing what's going on. To me, we are at a point where, for me personally, whatever time I have left on this earth, I want to show up for my country in the presence of what I see is a serious threat to our democracy.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule.
I appreciate you having me.
And look forward to doing this again.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much. And good luck to you. You have a big burden on your hands, and I wish you and your people the best.
We just one day at a time, right?
Yeah.